The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation presents Our Story, hosted by the Foundation's chairman and president, Jason Villalba. Each week on Our Story, hear the personal and intimate stories of Hispanics all across Texas, told in their own voices. Our Story provides insight into a community of people who are literally and figuratively changing the complexion of the United States. This is who we are.
Welcome back to the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation's podcast, Our Story, where we bring you the stories of Texas Latinos from all walks of life, from business to politics to entertainment. We try to share with you some of the more interesting stories of our fellow Hispanics in Texas. Today, I have someone who's an icon in Texas business. Someone who has been a mentor and a counselor to me for many years. I got to know Bob Estrada, proper name Robert Estrada, when I was early involved in politics in Texas. And his counsel and guidance during that time was just absolutely instrumental to me. I got a chance to hear his story, learn about him, and just learn from him. You're going to hear about many awards that he's won during this podcast today, but the one that I think matters to most to the people that are listening today is he is the current president of Texas Exes and a former member of the Board of Regents of the University of Texas. So any of my Longhorn friends and family out there, you know how important that is. So I'd like to welcome my friend, Bob Estrada.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to join you today.
What an honor to have you here, not only because of your storied history, but just because we're friends and just because it's such an honor for me to have these opportunities to spend time with people that I've just gotten to know. And so I'm anxious to hear your story. I know you and I have had many chats over coffee and lunch about it, but I think the people will be very interested in you and where you come from. So let's go way back to the beginning. I believe you're from the Rio Grande Valley, or actually Laredo, I believe. So tell me a little bit about your growing up.
Well, my hometown that I've always claimed all my life is Brownsville, Texas. It's a little further down the river than Laredo, but we're right at the tip of Texas, Brownsville. That's where my mother is from. She was born and raised in Brownsville. That's where we all settled. But interestingly, I was actually born in Mexico City. And my father was stationed in Mexico City in the job that he was in for several years during World War II. And so he was still there living. He and my mother were living in Mexico City when I was born in 1947, and I was less than a year old when he was transferred back to Brownsville. And my mother said she wasn't going to move again, and they settled down and stayed put in Brownsville, Texas. So I had the great privilege of being a dual citizen because I was, if you're born in Mexico, you're a Mexican citizen automatically, but my mother and father took me to the American Embassy as soon as I was born and had me registered as a United States citizen born abroad. So I was really a U.S. citizen from birth and very proud of that. So that's how I got to Brownsville indirectly. But that's really home for me, was Brownsville.
So you were born an American. Your parents were Americans, but they were spending time for business in Mexico. Were your grandparents from Mexico, or?
All of my ancestors were Mexican. My mother's Mexican. Her parents were both born in Mexico, eventually naturalized as U.S. citizens. But she was born a U.S. citizen at Brownsville, but was, of course, 100% Mexican heritage. And so is my father. My father was born in Mexico City, but as a child, he and his siblings and their mother fled to California during the Mexican Revolution. And he ended up growing up in Los Angeles. And eventually he was naturalized and became a U.S. citizen, but he was pure Mexican heritage and blood. And I was baptized Roberto Alfonso Estrada. That was my name at birth. That's on my birth certificate. And there's a funny story that goes with that. When I started school in first grade in Brownsville, Texas, the teacher was calling the roll the first day of school, and she got to my name and she said, Roberto Estrada. And I held up my hand. And then she went further down the list and she said, Roberto Gonzalez. And Roberto Gonzalez held up his hand. And the teacher turned back to me and said, Estrada, from now on, you're Robert. Gonzalez, you're Roberto. And for the rest of my schooling in Brownsville, Texas, for the 12 years I went to school, I was always Robert, and my buddy Roberto was Roberto Gonzalez.
Probably to this day, Roberto.
Yeah. So I grew up as Robert Estrada, and on all the legal documents I have, except one or two, I've always been Robert, middle initial A, Estrada. And of course, then when I got to college at the University of Texas, I would introduce myself to people I was meeting as Robert Estrada, and they would also always answer back saying, oh, nice to meet you, Bob. Yeah, it's great to meet you, Bob. And then I majored in broadcasting journalism, and it turned out to be a lot easier as a future journalist to have a tagline that said, this is Bob Estrada reporting from the scene instead of.
So you were on
Robert.
Television or radio?
Yeah, television. I was a television news reporter, first job out of college. I was trained in journalism and broadcasting. My first job out of college in the summer of 1969 was in Dallas, Texas at Channel 8 WFAA television. I was a news intern, and I was on the air occasionally reporting some of the news I was covering.
So this would have been probably in the late 70s?
It was the summer of 1969.
So late 60s.
It was the summer that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon.
There probably weren't many brown-skinned Hispanics from Brownsville on television at that time. How were you received?
I was received just fine. Yeah, I was recommended by the dean of the College of Communication at University of Texas, recommending me for that job as an intern. And I hit it off with all the staff and had a great experience that summer. And that prompted me to go back to the Rio Grande Valley. And I immediately got a job at the CBS station in Harlingen, Texas, called KGBT. And I was a full-time reporter.
You're a trailblazer.
Yeah.
I mean, really making a difference in broadcast media.
Oh, I was having visions of being the next Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather, all the other famous names you saw on TV. But it was just something I was going to do temporarily until I went back to law school and became a lawyer, got a real job. But
So growing up in Brownsville, did you go to the public schools or was it a private school there?
Well, it's an interesting story because my parents, from the moment that myself and my brothers and my sister were born, it was instilled in us that we were going to go to college no matter what they had to do to get us through college.
So both mom and dad were pushing that. That was something that was important. So they recognized the importance of education early.
Absolutely. And my father had worked his way, working very, very hard.
Were mom and dad educated? Did they go to college as well?
Well, my father, who grew up in California, in Los Angeles, his mother was a widow. She raised my father, his older brother, and his sister in Los Angeles, and then got by the best they could. And my father worked his way, worked to help the family, but also worked to get himself educated. And he ended up graduating from the University of California at Berkeley with a degree in mechanical engineering. And his older brother had already done the same thing at Berkeley.
Well, that's quite impressive. So this would have been probably in the 60s.
In the 30s.
Oh, in the 30s.
He graduated in 1937 from Berkeley.
A Mexican man graduating from the University of Berkeley with a mechanical engineering. So he
waited tables in dormitories and did odd jobs off campus, and he managed to get through. His sister stayed in college after her bachelor degree and ended up with a PhD and was a college professor for 40 plus years in Long Beach, California.
Oh.
So education was just ingrained in that family history. And my mother grew up in the 30s in Brownsville, Texas. And in those days, Latina women were lucky to get through high school, much less going to college. And she ended up going to a community, not a community, but what they used to call business college in those days, where they taught women how to take shorthand or how to type and be good secretaries, that kind of thing. She did that. So she had a little bit of post-high school, but she went to an all-girls Catholic school in Brownsville.
Do you think culturally, and this is off a divergence, but do you think culturally that mentality has survived the last century? So, my mom was never pushed to go to college. I know that other Hispanic families often will push the sons to go, less so for the females, the women. Do you think that still exists, or are we starting to get?
It's moved on. I think it has changed over the decades since those days for various reasons. And a lot of it has to do with the growth of the overwhelming growth of the Latino community across the country, and a lot in Texas. And you have people from all kinds of backgrounds. You have all kinds of different ambitions and attitudes of what represents a successful life. And unfortunately, for a lot of people in our culture, being a success in life is driving the newest car, the biggest car, or having some kind of material, advantages from others that others don't have. And that was never part of our culture growing up in terms of our family. And you asked about my schooling. My parents were very devout Christians. They had strong belief in religion. And for two reasons, they sacrificed financially to send my brothers and my sister and I to private Catholic school. There was an all-boys Catholic school in Brownsville. And my sister went to the same girls' Catholic school that my mother graduated from. And they were doing two things. Number one, they were helping to instill in us those Christian values that were taught in those kind of schools. And it also gave us a college prep education that wasn't really what you would get going to the public schools in those days, in Brownsville anyway. And so they really prepared us to do well in college by making the financial sacrifice to pay the tuition to make sure we were in Catholic school. And we were being taught by teachers, religious teachers that had master's degrees, PhDs, and it really, really made a difference.
So college was never in question. That was something that was ingrained in your DNA by mom and dad. Obviously, your history with your entire family, they were college educated and highly educated. So that was never in doubt. University of Texas, obviously one of the more important universities in the country, but you probably had your pick, was my guess, to go anywhere at the time, maybe not. How did you choose UT, and what was your experience like there?
That's a very interesting question, and it tells a story that very few people on earth have heard, but it's not a secret. I've told it to a number of people, but there's a very, very interesting story of how I got to the University of Texas, because nobody in my family that had ever gone to the University of Texas had gone to college, but not the University of Texas. And I didn't have any cousins or uncles or anything that were loyal to the University of Texas. I had friends that I grew up with that went to school together, that some of them went to the University of Texas, and a lot of them went to Texas A&M University. And those were the two most popular colleges for people I grew up with. And I ended up going to community college in Brownsville, what's called Texas Southmost College. It's a community college in Brownsville. And I went there for my first and second year to save my parents some money. And then I transferred to the University of Texas for my junior and senior year. And that was a little more expensive for the family, but I got there. And when it came time to decide where I was going to transfer to, it was almost an exact tie between Texas A&M and the University of Texas. I liked both of them. I was very, very impressed by the traditions of Texas A&M and some of the famous graduates from that university. And I was probably leaning toward going to Texas A&M because of their traditions and their, at that time and still today, very, very, a lot of things to be proud of. But I was determined to get the kind of training that I previously mentioned about being a broadcast journalist, learning to be on television, reporting the news properly. And the University of Texas in those days had just created the College of Communication. Less than 2 years before I transferred there, they created out of nothing a College of Communication that still exists today, that taught journalism, taught broadcasting, taught technical side. There was a film professors that taught promising film directors, movie makers.
So you knew you wanted to do that even before you went to college. So you're thinking to yourself, this is what I want to do, broadcast journalism.
Yeah. And Texas A&M didn't have that kind of College of Communication. And at that time, they were begging, UT was begging for students to sign up for courses in radio and TV and broadcast journalism just to fill up the classes. Today, that is the second hardest school to get into if you're transferring or if you're applying to the University of Texas in the College of Communication. There's a long waiting list. The hardest school to get into is the business school. The second hardest is the College of Communication. That's how powerful it's become. And they have separate campuses. College of Communication teaches classes and has students living on remote campuses in Hollywood, California, and in New York City, learning firsthand and being with the people they're ultimately going to be working with and be supervising, perhaps.
That's great.
And so that's what made me pick the University of Texas. Not that there was anything wrong with me at the time, but that's where I decided to go. And 3 of my best friends that I'd gone from first grade to 12th grade with from Brownsville were also going to the University of Texas already. And they were looking for a 4th roommate to rent a 2-bedroom apartment off campus. And so I went up and joined my 3 old friends and shared a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 other guys. And we took turns cooking and cleaning. And that's where I lived for 2 years while I finished my bachelor degree.
So this is UT in the 60s.
I graduated in 1969. Went there in 67, graduated in May of 69.
It's not a diverse campus at this time. Was it culture shock getting up there? Because you come from Brownsville, where most people are going to be Latino. You probably were speaking English in the home, but you may have had an accent from before or whatever. Sure. You go to this campus, it's probably 85% Anglo. How was that? Well,
it's an interesting question because when I was in my first year in the College of Communication there, which I was a junior in college, was my first year at UT, growing up in Brownsville, I never considered myself as having, quote, an accent, unquote. Everybody talked like me and when they spoke English. And one of my college professors in communication, talking about broadcasting, said, well, now, the first thing we need to do is work on your accent and kind of, try to adapt a more neutral, what we call a Midwestern accent, that you don't sound like you're from Brooklyn, you don't sound like you're from California, but you want to sound like the way Walter Cronkite sounds on TV. And so I didn't know I had an accent until that year, but I worked on that. And I think to this day, I speak a little bit differently. But no, there were a lot of other friendly faces all over the campus. Of course, I started out with 3 best friends living with them on campus, and that was great. And they introduced me to friends they had. I got involved in the student council for the College of Communication, and that made some immediate friends, and I got to know people that way. I had a classmate in a journalism class, a woman in our journalism class that we were friends and, would run into each other at different functions. And she eventually became publisher of the Wall Street Journal in New York. And I mean, that's the kind of quality of people I was surrounded by.
Well, it's UT, of course.
Oh, man.
So the experience there was obviously tier A. You enjoyed that. You had a wonderful background in education. You decide you're going to start in this area. You transfer to CBS down back home. Mm-hmm. Why law school?
Well, I had always had a desire to be a lawyer since I was probably in about 7th or 8th grade. We had a field trip at our school to the federal courthouse. I think the first federal judge, U.S. District Court judge appointed in the state of Texas in the early 1960s, the first Mexican-American federal judge was appointed by President John F. Kennedy, and it was a very distinguished judge named Ronaldo Garza of Brownsville, Texas. And he made history, and he was esteemed. He ended up being a senior judge for many, many years, even after he retired, and inspired a lot of other Latinos to apply for, to try to work toward being a federal judges. And today it's very, very common to have a lot of federal judges that are Latinos, Hispanics. But Ronaldo Garza was a judge. We went to his courtroom to hear about what was the experience of being a judge, how do trials work in federal courts. And I knew, my parents knew the judge, and he had two sons that were in school with me, one a year ahead and one a year behind me, that were friends of mine. But when we were sitting there listening to him tell us about being a judge and how he got there, he said, "Do any of you boys in the audience, do you think you might want to be a lawyer someday and maybe become a judge?" I put my hand up and I said, "That sounds like that looks great to be up there in a black robe and being a judge." And he said, "You need to keep studying and study hard and don't give up and keep your word to me." And he was a great inspiration to me.
That's inspirational to have characters and people like that who touch your life. For me, you're one of those, just because your example is an inspiration to, people that were coming up when I was coming up in politics, just to see what you had done. And we haven't gotten to that part yet. We'll continue to do that. It's a volatile time in the late 60s, early 70s. There's probably lots of protests. There's probably lots of animus on a bunch of different fronts. How did you stay out of that? How did you stay out of getting involved in those conflicts around the Vietnam War, around politics, or maybe you didn't? What was that like during that time? How did you avoid some of the quagmires?
That's a very interesting and very deep question, because I did stay out of what I think you're alluding to is the, joining the protests, marching in the streets with other students at the time. And that was prevalent across the whole United States on almost every college campus. And I didn't stay uninvolved, but I didn't participate in those kinds of, in either way, to be promoting what was happening in the war, or to be actively protesting in the streets either. And one of the reasons for that is that I had an older brother. I was the second son born. I had an older brother and I have a younger brother. My older brother, his dream was to be a pilot, to fly airplanes. He fell in love with airplanes when he was in middle school and joined the Civil Air Patrol in Brownsville, learned about flying, and he eventually applied for and was accepted at the Air Force Academy, United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And he graduated in 1966 from the Air Force Academy with honors and went straight to pilot training and became an Air Force pilot. And 4 years later, in 1970, he was a captain in the Air Force. He was sent for a tour of duty in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia. And he ended up being killed in action in Southeast Asia.
So sorry.
In the spring of 1970. I was less than a year out of college at that time. And we had very mixed feelings in our family. We obviously had a deep loss and felt it severely, no matter how it happened. And we certainly weren't for the war, but we didn't, we didn't blame the government for being in the war, for his dying. It was just, in my opinion, it was God's will that was as long as he was going to be on earth, and he was doing what he believed in and what he loved to do. And he's buried at the Air Force Academy Cadet Cemetery in Colorado to this day. But it really kept me from taking sides or arguing one way or the other, but just took a step back and observed the whole thing. There's been hundreds and hundreds of books written about the war in Vietnam and why it happened, why it shouldn't have happened. And nobody will ever decide that one side or the other was right. My younger brother, what he came to the University of North Texas in Denton to their flagship campus when he started college, right after I graduated from UT. He decided to come to UNT, and he was out protesting. He was much younger than I am, and he joined all the students that were marching whenever there were protests, and I certainly didn't have anything against that, but I just wasn't the kind of personality that was going to drop everything I was doing and go out there with him.
Yeah.
But
You're a very measured person. You're very thoughtful in everything that you do. And so I sense that that might have been part of your analysis. Look, there is injustice and there are wars that we may or may not agree with, but we do love our government. We love the United States. And so I can see why you came to that conclusion. You finished law school and you end up in politics quickly, as I recall. I'd love to hear that story.
The other way around.
Oh, no, okay. So correct me.
I got way into politics
Before law school.
Before law school.
Okay. So you're in CBS then. You're down in Brownsville.
Right.
You get involved in politics.
I got a call from a friend of mine saying he knew somebody that had heard about me and wanted to interview me for a job in Austin. And they would pay my way to Austin on a weekend to meet with this gentleman and talk about the position and pick up my hotel and meals and everything.
Free trip to Austin.
It was a free trip to Austin to see some old friends. I thought, well, what I got to lose? Just, waste 2 days in Austin and come back to what I'm doing. I had no intention of, leaving what I was doing. I was having the time of my life as a TV reporter. But I went up to Austin on that Friday and sat down the next day with this fellow who was looking for someone who was bilingual, knew the border area, the region of the Rio Grande Valley and up and down the Texas-Mexico border, but that also was a good writer, that someone who could write a short essay, talking points, and do some research. And of course, that was all my skills as a reporter. And they wanted me to work in a job that was basically going to be I was going to be working for a politician who was running for United States Senator from Texas in 1970, the November elections of 1970. And there was a congressman from Houston who was running against the Democrat senator that was up for re-election, whose name was Ralph Yarbrough. Ralph Yarbrough had been in the Senate, I think, for 3 terms at that time. And the Republicans decided to run a congressman from Houston against Ralph Yarbrough. They thought he was very unpopular and could be beaten in the November elections. And they wanted somebody like the job they were interviewing me for was to be with him whenever he traveled along the border areas and anywhere in South Texas, and to brief him when he would go down there. And these are the issues you want to touch on. This is what you want to say about them, if you believe in those things. And here's who we're going to be meeting with, and this is why they're important and who they are. And
A campaign manager of sorts.
Not a manager, because it's a big state. It was a big campaign.
For the region.
But for that region, to be like an advisor to him for Latino. In 1970, the word Hispanic wasn't even created yet. Mexican American was the common term. But he wanted somebody that could tell him, how do Mexican Americans, how do they think? How do they vote? What do they want to hear? Someone that they're voting for office. And when they mentioned how much they were willing to pay me to do that, it was about 3 times what I was making as a TV reporter. And it was somebody that I had followed, from a distance as a politician that I really liked and thought very highly of. And I thought, what the heck, this might be a lot of fun. And when I went back and told my boss at the TV station about it, he said, oh, I think you should do it. He said, that'll give you such experience that it'll make you an even better reporter. And you'll be great at that, and you'll be more valuable. So go do it, and we'll keep your job open because that guy's going to lose in November. And so you'll be back. What do you mean he's going to lose? That's why I'm going to work for him. I already had dreams of going to Washington, D.C. with this new senator. Well, in the fall of 1970, when primary party elections were all in September, a Democrat opponent to Ralph Yarbrough came out of nowhere and defeated Yarbrough, and then he became the Democrat candidate,
the nominee
for U.S. Senate.
Who was that?
And his name was Lloyd Benson.
Lloyd.
And Lloyd Benson spent the next 24 years in the Senate and had a great career and was a great senator. The guy I worked for all that year and traveled all over South Texas with was named George Herbert Walker Bush, and he gave up his seat in Congress to run for senator, and he lost. And he eventually, after he lost that election and left the Congress, he was appointed ambassador to the United Nations in New York. And all the political pundits wrote it off and said, we'll never hear from that guy again. He's going to the United Nations, and sayonara. Well, and
like K. Bailey Hutchison did.
And then instead of going back to my reporting job, somebody else offered me a very high-paying job in the government, with a government agency that dealt with hurricane disaster relief. And I all of a sudden became a public information officer with the government, trying to let people know how to apply for assistance from a big hurricane that had just gone through South Texas, Corpus Christi, in that area. And
because you do the area.
And it was a long time. I was based in Corpus Christi, and I was on radio and TV trying to explain to people, here's what you have to do to apply for temporary housing for those mobile homes that used to be brought in by the government to house people till they could rebuild. And I was doing that on the media in English and in Spanish. And it turned out to be a real fun job. And they eventually made me a director of an office doing that. And I spent a few years working in federal government, making way more money than I had made as a reporter. And then eventually met a young lady and got married in 1975. And
on the trail or in school or
just in Dallas, living in Dallas, working in the government.
I want to go back quickly because you're in the government now. Mm-hmm. This is under a Republican president, 72, so that's going to be Nixon. That's you worked for HW. Did you know you were a Republican when you took that job, or were you agnostic, or was this just something that you knew was the right fit for you?
I felt in high school, and studying government and politics in high school, in Brownsville, I decided I was probably a Republican. And I thought in those days, Texas was a one-party state and everything was controlled by the Democrat Party. And in South Texas, it was even more radical. And it not only was it one-party dominance in South Texas, but it was kind of a system where once you were in an office, you stayed in that office for 40 or 50 years till you drop dead, and then someone would move up from below. And it didn't lend itself to good government, in my opinion. And I always thought we should probably have more competition than I see for government, and a two-party state would be better for the people. And that made me a Republican more than anything. It's almost the other way around now, where we're becoming too much of a one-party state.
And it does create some problems with government when you have one side making all the decisions, just because you just don't get that even-handed kind of centrism that...
Things can change in 50 years.
Yeah.
And it has.
It has.
That was, my parents were very, very diligent voters. They studied the candidates for running, even though they were all Democrat. They would read about them and study who would maybe be a better office holder than the other. And they always showed up to vote. But neither my father nor my mother were involved in partisan politics in any way. They never went to meetings of one party or the other. They just showed up to vote on election day. And they taught us those lessons. So I was really the only Republican
in the region. So that probably lent itself well, particularly when you're working in a government administration that's chosen by the executive branch, which would be where you were. And then you end up with another senator.
Yeah. Well, even before I was a reporter, I had followed the career of George Bush and really liked the things he said publicly, the ideas he had as a congressman. And so I was thrilled to be working for him. I thought he was going to be a U.S. Senator. But that year that I traveled all over South Texas with George and Barbara Bush, Mrs. Bush would treat me like one of her own sons, and we'd have breakfast together, talk about what we're doing each day. We'd have dinner at night together wherever we were staying. And it really created a bond between myself and George Herbert Walker Bush that existed the rest of my life and brought me many, many advantages the rest of my life. And my last job in politics was in 1989 when he became president of the United States after being vice president for 8 years under President Reagan. And I was summoned to Washington to work as a special assistant to the president in the White House staff in 1989. And I was thrilled to do that. And that was my last job in politics, and came back to Texas. And
what's it like to be in the White House and work in that environment? I mean, this is 89, so there's so many things that are happening in the world. The Berlin Wall is falling, the Gulf War is being fought. Politics is...
It's really inspiring. It's so awesome. When you walk in the halls of the West Wing in the White House and look at the pictures on the wall, walk past the doors of people that are in those offices that books are going to be written about eventually, it really blows your mind to pinch yourself and say, I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm around all these.
What moment during that time that you were in the White House do you remember the most? And it doesn't have to be the happiest memory, but it can be the one that's like, wow, this is a big moment.
Well, it's kind of interesting. You know, I went to Washington in that job. It was a combination of moments, but it was one thing that happened to me that really gave me great confidence. And I went to Washington thinking, gosh, I'm so lucky to be an assistant to the President of the United States. And I had the feeling, and maybe too many of us of our culture have that feeling still. I had the feeling that I'm probably the dumbest guy in the room when I'm going to be surrounded by all these experts on all these issues and very high-powered people that had already left very important jobs and businesses to come also be on the White House staff. And I thought, if I open my mouth, I'm going to sound like an idiot around all these smart people. I don't know how I'm going to keep up with things here. And one of my jobs, I was in the part of the staff that was interviewing and screening candidates for high-level appointments that had to be confirmed by the Senate. And one of the areas that I was in charge of was to find a new chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, because the previous chairman had already resigned, was leaving town, and there was a vacancy. So I went and talked to my immediate boss that was in charge of all the appointments offices. And I said, okay, for the Federal Communications Commission, we have a bunch of resumes on file, people that are interested, but what do I need to ask these candidates when they come in for interviews? What are President Bush's views on communication? What does he want his FCC chairman to do for the next 4 years? And I thought he would know. My boss was a former high-level official under President Reagan and even before that, and had known President Bush for 30 years. And he said, I don't have any idea, but he says, I've never heard him talk about communications policy. And that was my boss. He says, why don't you go talk to the speechwriter that was with him in the campaign? I'm sure he gave some speech somewhere in the campaign that he mentioned communication. I went down the hall in the West Wing, talked to that guy. He says, I have no idea what president's views are on communication. He sent me to the domestic policy advisor. He didn't have a clue. And I went back to my office and I looked at the wall and I thought, none of these guys are smarter than me. They don't know much more than I do about a lot of things. And, I'm going to show them I know as much as they do or more. And I went to work interviewing all kinds of people to make sure that what should policies be and would they be something that Bush administration would oppose? And I put together the criteria for that job and eventually found the right person. And that person was nominated for chairman and confirmed by the Senate. And other things like that. I filled positions for the Securities and Exchange Commission, for Department of Treasury, Department of Justice.
What an experience.
It was fantastic.
I mean, during that time, what an experience to be able to just shape policy at a national level that would make that kind of a difference.
It was. And then, of course, we'd always, when we were off working in the White House complex, and there'd be a big ceremony, arrival ceremony of some head of state from out of the country coming to visit the president, and they would arrive by helicopter on the South Lawn. They'd invite all of us to go out on the South Lawn and see the ceremony and wave to everybody. And it was really, really very moving experience. And in those days, until this last January, when there was such a tumultuous type of transition from one president to another, in those days, democracy worked the way it's supposed to. And when your term was over as president, you left the stroke of noon on the day of the inauguration. You were no longer president, and the new guy was the new president. And it turned out I had been working for a couple of weeks in the White House on the transition organization before Bush took the oath of office. And so I was going in and out of the West Wing of the White House while President Reagan was still president. For the last week, he was president. And you'd walk up and down the halls of the West Wing, and all the walls were covered with photographs of the president, of Mrs. Reagan at different ceremonies with different crowds, meeting with different people. And you always saw them on the wall. And the day before the inauguration, I was in a meeting in the West Wing, saw all of those same photos like I'd always seen. The next day, George H.W. Bush is sworn in as president at 12 noon. They have the parade, and they eventually get back into the White House. And I had something I had to pick up from my boss's office. The next day, I was going to be sworn in as a high official at the White House staff. I had to pick up some paperwork from my boss. I go over to see him about 6 o'clock on the day of the inauguration. And when I walked inside down the hall to his office in the West Wing, all of the photographs on the walls of the West Wing were photographs of the inauguration, of the swearing in, all George and Barbara Bush everywhere, their family, their dog, like if Ronald Reagan had never existed. I mean, in a number of hours, that's how fast the White House was changed from one president to the other. And it's very sad that we didn't see that kind of peaceful transition this last January.
That's a fascinating transition and story. And so after that experience in the White House, that truly must have been an incredible time for you, there were some changes that were coming in your life. I want to talk about a personal situation and how that might have impacted your leaving the White House. So let's talk about that. Tell me a little bit about your wife at the time and your children, and then what happened.
Certainly. I finished my work that I was undertaking at the White House on the White House staff and making presidential appointments, screening people for high-level appointments. And that job was pretty much done the first 10 months of President George H.W. Bush's first term in 1989. And so by Thanksgiving of that year of 1989, I was pretty much done. And I had been commuting back and forth from Dallas. My family was still in Dallas, and I decided to come home and get back to work full time and taking care of them. And so I gave my notice and left on very great terms from the White House staff and came back to Dallas, Texas, and decided that instead of going back to practicing law full time, it maybe was a good time to jump to the idea I had had for many years of creating an investment banking, a municipal finance business that would do a better job than was being done by any of the existing companies for the many, many entities in South Texas, throughout the Texas-Mexico border, that were really being immensely underserved by professionals in our industry. And I thought it was time to create a company that would pay attention to those municipalities, counties, cities, school districts all over South Texas that weren't getting the kind of attention they deserved, the kind of service that they deserved, and paying more than they should have to borrow money for public purposes. And I started the idea of creating an investment bank. In the middle of all that initial planning, my wife got sick very suddenly and passed away in February of 1990. And it was all very sudden. And she passed away suddenly. And I was all of a sudden became a single parent and father and mother to my 5 little beautiful daughters. The oldest daughter was about 14. My twin daughters that are the youngest were 6 years old. And I started putting my attention to taking care of them and making sure they were getting through that traumatic experience well, and dedicated most of that year of 1990 to just keeping the family together, making sure the girls were healing after their grieving and ready to go forward and live a good life. And in the process of all that, consulted with my dear friend, Noe Hinojosa Jr., that I had known for many years. He was an outstanding municipal bond investment banker already with another company. And I convinced him to join forces with me and create the company that we started in January of 1992, which is called Estrada Hinojosa and Company Incorporated. And we've been in business for almost 30 years now and have built a wonderful firm of 50 people in our firm, with our headquarters office still in Dallas, but 7 other offices in Texas and around the country, and been very successful, never had a bad year. And from the very first year, the very beginnings of our company, my business partner and close friend, like a brother to me, Noe Hinojosa, said to me, "Your first priority is taking care of those 5 girls, and that's always going to be your main concern. Don't worry about the office. We'll take care of that. And you just come in whenever you can and work as much as you can or can't and take care of your family." And of course, I've spent many, many years and a lot of time dedicated to the company, but it also enabled me and gave me the confidence to be a single parent for almost 10 years and making sure those girls grew up correctly and had the right intentions of going to college and getting their college education, which they all did. And they're all adults now and very successful young ladies with happy families together. We continued from there on. I remarried in 2000. In the year 2000, I married a wonderful woman whose husband had died the year before. And we were introduced by a mutual friend, and we fell in love and got married in 2000. And been married 21 years now. And she took on those 5 daughters when they were all teenagers, and half of them were already in college. And she helped me finish raising them and polishing all the rough edges off of them, teaching them to be true ladies and supporting them in every single way a mother could. And it was the best mother of the bride anyone could ask for when all 5 of them had their individual weddings. And she's now the greatest grandmother on earth to 10 little grandchildren. And we're having the time of our lives. And still very active in my business, but enjoy doing things in the community together with my wife, who's very committed to community service herself. Both of us very involved in the community and different nonprofit entities that we believe in, and living a wonderful life. I couldn't ask the good Lord for more.
There's so much to unpack there. I want to talk about the business, and I want to talk about the second wife, who is just an amazing woman. I've known her and have had a chance to visit with her, and she's a special human being. But I want to go back to 1990, the unexpected loss of your first wife and having 5 daughters. I have 3 children, ages roughly 8 to 14. I can't imagine if we lost my wife. I mean, as you must have experienced at the time, the wives really run the house and they run all the logistics around the kids. And, that's, at least in my household, that may not be not the case for everyone, but I think that's how it was for you after having been gone for so long. How much of a change to lifestyle must that have been coming from the White House, where you were integrated into every moment of the transition into the new president, and then coming home and being dad, which is probably a role that you were familiar with, but not in that regard. What was that like? How did that change you?
You're very right. It was a tremendous change for me, a tremendous challenge for me. And it was one that, without any question, it changed my life dramatically, but it changed it for the better. And despite being widowed and losing someone I was so close to, it made me a better person today, back then and today, than I would have ever been, because I had to step up and learn how to be mother and father to those little girls, and to learn a lot of things and take on more interests and priorities that I had never had to worry about. And that was the most important thing in my life, was to take care of them and pay the attention to all the things I had to. And it made me a better person. I'm from that generation of Latino men that we grew up, where I grew up in a wonderful, loving family, but the mom took care of the house. The mom made all the rules and ran the house on a day-to-day basis. And the father went to work and brought home the bacon and made sure everybody got fed and clothed and had a roof over their head. But the father wasn't ever the prominent, parent in my family. And I grew up with, that was the example I had. My father was like a saint. He's a wonderful man. He's my hero and one of the greatest persons I'll ever meet. And I had to learn from both him and my mother that there were a lot of responsibilities to raising children. And I realized that, and I took it on, and I made a promise to myself that I would learn what I had to learn to keep those girls going and do it right. And in a lot of ways, you can imagine with 5 sisters all together, a lot of ways that they grew up was they raised each other in a way. The older daughters helped the younger ones, and they learned things from the younger ones, and they stuck together and always were a team and always very close. To this day, they're very, very close to each other. They talk daily to each other. It's a wonderful thing. I've been very, very blessed.
Sharing the loss of a mom, I can't imagine that, but I imagine that the result is, like you say, the closeness that they share is probably enhanced materially from ordinary brothers and sisters, particularly if they're all sisters. They're grieving that year, obviously devastating for you to watch them to be sad and to watch them go through that. But how did they react to dad now being mom? I mean, are you learning how to French braid and cook and go to the ballet classes? How are they?
Sure.
They're probably taking care of you too, because they recognize that you're in a new role.
Oh, they love me very, very much. And I hear from them constantly every week of the year. I'll hear from 2 or 3 of them, and they stay in very close touch. And I couldn't ask to be more loved than what they've shown me, and the gratitude, the letters I get, the notes they write, and every year in a birthday card that I might get, or a Valentine's card from them, Father's Day cards, all the notes they've written over the years to me, it means a lot. And it shows that they appreciated and recognized what we were going through. I took them the first year that after their mother died, that entire year, 12 months after her passing away, I took the daughters every Saturday. We'd go and meet with a child psychologist for hours at a time, and they'd talk through all the things they were feeling and hurting. And we did that for the better part of a year. And the psychologist finally pulled me aside one day, months later, and said, "Mr. Estrada, your daughters are as well adjusted as any young child I've ever counseled and they're doing wonderful. And if you want to keep paying me to spend time with them, I'll be glad to. But they don't need any psychological counseling. They're well balanced and happy and thrilled to be with you. And that meant a lot. So I think we did all the right things, and it certainly paid off in the kind of women they are today and the way they're raising their own children today.
The story of situations like that, and on this show, I've had the opportunity to hear several stories like that where we as individuals face great tragedy and great loss. But from these stories, over and over again, what I hear is the resilience and the strength of the people that face these, and that their takeaway is always to be stronger afterwards and to learn more about themselves. And like you just said it earlier, it made me a better person. That to me is remarkable, right? I mean, to have lost somebody so loved in the household, and then to say later on, after you've gone through this and after your daughters have gone through this, that it made me a better person. That's remarkable. Tell me about your support system that time. I know your sister well. Sure. Mom, dad, grandparents came involved. Who came together to be a part of that?
I was just going to say that I couldn't end this without giving tremendous credit to my sister, Laura, that lives in Dallas, lived where I live in Dallas together at that time. She still lives in Dallas. And she and her husband had decided when they married to not have children. And so she was a mom herself, but certainly dedicated to helping me in any way she could be helpful. We've been very close all our lives. And so she was my safety net. I was able to get on an airplane and go out of town on business when necessary, knowing that my sister Laura had my legal power of attorney. If anything happened suddenly, if one of the children was injured in some way or whatever, she would be right there immediately taking care of them, signing any legal documents. She looked after them. And of course, I always had some hired help that would be live-in assistants to keep the house going and be there to make meals and so forth. But Laura and her husband, Paul Herman, were just so instrumental in being my backup, as well as my business partner, Noé, that I mentioned earlier, helping me in every way. And that made it much more reasonable and much more successful in what I was able to take on. But I get asked all my life, I've been asked, what's the hardest thing? What's the greatest goal you ever accomplished? And talking about going to college, going to law school, working for a president of the United States, et cetera. I tell them that the thing I'm most proud of in my entire life is raising those girls. So that means a lot to me. And it all worked.
You've done so many things in life. You've accomplished so much. To hear you say that about your daughters, and that's your greatest accomplishment. I hear you loud and clear. As a dad myself, to me, that's the most important thing that I do. And I just, again, you've always been a mentor to me and an inspiration to me. But those are powerful words. And so thank you for that. With 5 daughters, you had 5 weddings to plan for, which means you had to make a lot of money. The business is growing at this point. It's 92. You started with Noé, who's an amazing person in his own right, and would love to talk to him as well. But for our listeners out there, investment banking and municipal bonds, what that means is local counties and cities often need to borrow money to build schools and to build highways and roads. And they don't always have the ability to do that out of their own coffers. So they'll raise those funds on markets. And so what Bob and his partner did was created opportunities for these cities and counties and local burgs in the country to raise that money so that they could build those schools and those highways. And at the time, there were no Hispanic-owned banks that were doing this. And if there were, they were very small shops. What you and Noe created was not only one of the Hispanic-owned businesses, but now it's become one of the biggest investment banks in this sector in the country, if not the world. Tell me about that, how it developed, and how you perceive that growth.
The business that we are in is very, very competitive, and it literally goes back to the beginning of our country. In the 1800s, there was already a Wall Street in New York City with all the major names, the things that are still around today, the names like J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, all those companies from even the 1800s and the last 100 years have been the ones that dominated this industry, this kind of business. And we're so proud that in just the last 30 years that we have existed as municipal advisors that get hired to guide any of these governments through the borrowing of money by the issuance of municipal bonds. In the 30 years we've been in this business, we have consistently been ranked well. And in the last 2 years, we have ranked as the number 5 company that does what we do across the entire United States. We're number 5.
And not Hispanic owned, number 5 overall.
Right. And as far as Hispanic owned companies, we're the number 1 company doing that. In Texas, we're the number 2 company after a company that's been in business for 60, 70 years that dominated the industry when we started. But we're always consistently right behind them in the rankings over many, many other companies that try to do what we do currently. So we're very, very proud of how far we've come in a short time. And it has saved a lot of money. It has saved a lot of money to governmental entities all across South Texas that never got the kind of attention they should have.
And that's a testament to your vision and to Noe's vision to recognize that there was that underserved community that would provide a good fit for that, and did that and created something unique and new that is now built into this amazing company that is world renowned as well. So much so that people took notice. I mean, if I were to read all of the awards that you've won over the last 25 years because of this work that you've done, we'd probably be here for the rest of the afternoon. But 2 that I'm most intrigued by, one's not an award. One is a role that you were appointed to. You were appointed to the Federal Reserve Board. Is that right?
Yeah, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas Board of Directors, not the Federal Reserve System in Washington, but on the board of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, which was a great honor. I was also at one time the chairman of the board of an entity created by Congress called the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. It is an entity, a nonprofit entity in Washington, D.C. that makes all the rules that have to be followed by any investment banks that do municipal bond transactions, which is practically every investment bank in the country. They make the rules. They work with regulators to enforce those rules. And I was on that board for 3 years, which was the limit. And the last year I was elected chairman by my colleagues on the board and chaired that, which was a very unique and unusual honor for people in our business. And I'm proud of that as well. And one of the main things about our success as a company has been always doing the right thing and treating our clients the way they deserve to be treated, and never trying to make a bigger profit by doing something that we didn't tell them. And that has made us so popular and so successful. In the financial crisis that the United States had in the years 2008 and 2009, we never suffered any losses. We didn't have any issues or problems that all these major national firms had to merge and be bought by banks to just survive. Names that had been around for 100 years, like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns Company, went out of business. They went bankrupt because they were not doing the right thing. And we had a great, successful year and still have ever since. And we're very, very proud of that.
I know that Estrada and Osa has a sterling reputation in the industry. I'm a business corporate attorney myself, and I have seen your company and business, and everyone understands and recognizes the importance of that organization, but also the goodness that they've provided to communities all around the state. It's for profit, of course, but it's done in a way that harkens back to an era that we seem to have escaped in the last 50 years. And so you're doing something the right way, as you point out. And I think it's been recognized by the awards that you've won. I want to close today with what we opened up with, and that is one awards, if you will, that I think embody what it is that you have been able to accomplish over a lifetime. And that is to be a leader of the community, a public servant, and a businessman. And at the University of Texas, very few people ever get to wear the orange jacket. You were awarded that orange jacket recently. Tell me about that award and what that ceremony was like and what it meant to you as a UT alum to have been awarded that special honor.
Thank you very much. Well, the Alumni Association for all graduates of the University of Texas at Austin, the Alumni Association is called the Texas Exes, and they're a nonprofit freestanding entity, but they're very supportive, of course, of the university. And every year they select a group of 5 or 6 individuals who are graduates of the University of Texas, whether it's undergraduate or graduate school or both. They select 5 or 6 in a very competitive process that's done very privately. They select successful graduates to be honored as distinguished alumni of the University of Texas at Austin. And every major university in the country has a similar program, similar practice of naming distinguished alumni. It's a great honor to have that in your obituary when you pass away, and to have been recognized when you consider the millions of people that have attended and graduated from the University of Texas. To be in a handful of persons that are honored in any given year is an incredible feat. And it happens every year. And in 2018 was when I was selected, having been nominated by various people that I know. And I made the final vote and was selected. And I had very outstanding fellow recipients who were, I think, even more important than I am and more successful, but we were all together to be honored. And when you look back, you can go to the website of the Texas Exes organization and look at all the people that have been honored before the 2018 year that I was honored. You can look at former recipients of that Distinguished Alumnus Award, and it's phenomenal. I mean, the people that are, have been governors and senators of Texas, have been CEOs of major corporations, astronauts, doctors that have discovered fantastic cures. I mean, the lineup is just phenomenal number of people. Our former First Lady, Laura Bush, she went to SMU undergrad, but got her master's degree in library science from the University of Texas in Austin. She's a distinguished alumnus. A great television and movie star, Matthew McConaughey, is a distinguished alumnus and is even now a professor in the College of Communications at the university. So I'm in some pretty amazing company to be in that list of honorees. And it's a great, great honor of my life, but nothing even close to being the parent of my 5 daughters.
Sure. There was one final cherry on top, if you will, from the Texas Exes. And this happened, I believe, last year, maybe 2019. Oh, yeah. And they made you the president of that organization for a period of time. Tell me about that.
Yes, I got a very surprise call 2 years ago telling me that I had been nominated and was going to be elected president-elect of the Texas Exes organization, and beginning in July of 2019. And I would spend a year on the board of directors as president-elect, learning the job of the president for a year. And then in July 1 of last year of 2020, then I stepped up to be the current president of the Alumni Association, representing over 500,000 graduates, living graduates now of the University of Texas. And it's a one-year term. It'll end on June 30th of this year, 2021. But it's been a great honor and experience and a phenomenal time to be president of the Texas Exes because of the pandemic that our country has endured, that the whole world is dealing with. But it has made it very difficult to have the traditional activities and events and socializing that were so common to every year someone serves as president. And all of it has had to be remote and virtual throughout the last 10 months. But I've still worked hard at it and been available and done my job. And it's been a great honor. And I look forward to the day that all of us can get together in public and in a crowd and be together and not be worried about making each other sick. And been very honored to serve in that role. And it's something that'll be very special to me for a long time.
Well, as an alumni of the University of Texas School of Law, thank you, because I am a Texas Ex, and I received the magazine and I follow online, and it's clear to me your contributions during this very difficult time have been, like everything you do, amazing and truly a compelling moment in the history of the university and our country, that you were the person at the head of the organization during that time. So let me just say personally, thank you. I want to close with a quote from Bob Estrada I just heard a moment ago. To get the job done. You know, we heard so many stories over the last 90 minutes about your life. And in each instance, it's about getting the job done, right? From learning how to be successful in college and then going back and being a member of the media and then working for Senators Tower and other political scions of Texas, to the White House, to your crowning accomplishment, raising your daughters, to business. Everything you seem to touch is successful. And I just think that it's a testament to who you are and to your character and what you embody and to what you just said, getting the job done. So that's just something that I guess for me is just a life lesson. I want to say thank you for that. Parting words would be, you know, look, we do a lot of these shows and I meet a lot of really interesting people, but Bob, you've always been a dear friend and just somebody who I look up to and aspire to be like. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for telling your story.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be asked to be part of one of these podcasts, and I'm happy to do it and glad to share my story with everyone. I should definitely close by giving, again, due credit to my parents, Carlos and Virginia Estrada, who raised me and my siblings to be good Christians and honest and honorable people, and to be well educated and to always think of others, and especially to always be very proud of our Mexican-American heritage and to instill that in our children and grandchildren and teach them Spanish, but to be good Americans and very loyal citizens. And I'm proud of that. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to sign off today at the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation. This has been Our Story with our featured storyteller today, Bob Estrada. Thank you. Next week will be our season finale with Mike Madrid from the Lincoln Project. So I look forward to having him on and look forward to seeing you either around Texas or online. Thank you. God bless.
The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation would like to thank you for joining us today on Our Story. You can find more information about the foundation at www.txhpf.org. on Facebook on the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation page, or on Twitter @TexHPF. Please join us next week on Our Story, a podcast dedicated to the voices of Texas Hispanics.